My father locked my 8-year-old daughter outside in a February storm because he said he wasn't going to feed a lying child under his roof. I can still hear the way the wind sounded on the call when my sister finally picked up the phone, 3 hours after it started. By the time the paramedics got her core temperature back to normal, my father was already telling the police it was a misunderstanding. He was already polishing his story. I want to tell you exactly how that polish came off. But first, tell me where you're watching from tonight, because I think you're going to need a strong cup of tea for this one. My name is Naomi. I'm 29, and for the last 6 years I've worked as a forensic accountant for one of the big audit firms downtown, the kind that gets called in when a company suspects someone on the inside is bleeding them dry. My family never understood what that actually meant. To them, I was just good with numbers, the quiet one who went to Western for accounting, while my older sister went into hospitality management, and my father built his property empire out of nothing but stubbornness and a knack for buying up triplexes before anyone else saw the value in them. By the time I was in university, my father owned half a city block in Oakville, plus a row of rental properties stretching from Burlington to Hamilton. He liked to remind us at every Thanksgiving that none of us would have a roof over our heads if it weren't for his hard work, as if we'd forgotten, as if he'd let us forget. I should explain about my daughter first, because none of this makes sense without her. Ivy is 8. She has my mother's curls and my husband's stubborn chin, and she has had a peanut allergy since she was 14 months old, the kind that means an EpiPen lives in every bag I own, in the glove box of my car, in a drawer at her school. She also has a mild form of asthma that flares badly in cold, wet weather, which matters more than you'd think to this story. My husband Dean and I separated last year, amicably enough, and he was overseas for 3 weeks on a project for the engineering firm he works for, which is the only reason Ivy was staying with my family in the first place. I had a forensic audit blow up on me that same week, a fraud case that needed me in Toronto around the clock, and I made the call every working parent dreads. I asked my father and stepmother to keep Ivy at the house in Oakville for a few days while I worked it out. I should have called my sister instead. I know that now. My father, Roland, married my stepmother, Carol, when I was 19, 2 years after my mother passed. Carol came with a son from her first marriage, a man named Travis who was already 30 by the time I met him, and a habit of treating our family home like it was simply a resource to be managed rather than a place anyone actually lived. My sister Phoebe stayed close to Dad over the years, mostly because she worked, on and off, as the property manager for 2 of his buildings, a job that paid her well above market rate and came with a condo he technically still owned. I never resented that. I built my own life on purpose, away from his money, because I'd watched what his money did to people who took it. The week I dropped Ivy off, Travis was also staying at the house. Between leases, he said, though it had been between leases for almost 8 months. Travis had never liked me much. I think it went back to a Christmas when I was 22, and pointed out gently that the contractor invoices he was submitting for a basement renovation at one of Dad's rental units didn't match what the actual contractor told me they'd been paid. Dad waved it off as a misunderstanding then too. Travis never forgave me for noticing. On the Thursday, the day it happened, Ivy had taken an old hockey card from a box in the garage. One Travis claimed was a rare 1979 O.P.G. Gretzky rookie, the kind collectors lose their minds over. She was 8? She didn't know what it was. She found a box of cards in a dusty container labeled Garage Misc and pulled a few out to look at, the way kids do, and then put them back loosely, not realizing they needed plastic sleeves and careful stacking. When Travis discovered the box disturbed 2 days later, he didn't ask Ivy what happened. He went straight to my father and told him the rookie card was missing, that it was worth $4,000, and that the only person who'd been near that box was the kid. My father didn't call me. He didn't call Phoebe to ask if she'd seen anything. He sat Ivy down at the kitchen table and demanded she tell him where she'd hidden it. My daughter, 8 years old, alone in that big stone house with a grandfather she was a little afraid of and a step-uncle who'd already decided she was guilty, told him over and over that she hadn't taken anything, that she'd put the cards back exactly where she found them. He didn't believe her. He told her liars don't get dinner in his house, and when she started crying and said she wanted to call me, he took her phone, the one I'd specifically given her for emergencies, and put it on the charger across the room, out of her reach. It was -12 degrees that night, with the wind chill closer to -20. There was a storm warning out for the whole Halton region, the kind where the news tells you to bring your pets inside and check on elderly neighbors. At some point that evening, after Ivy kept insisting on her innocence and asking to go home, my father told her to go cool off outside until she was ready to tell the truth, and he locked the side door behind her, not the front door, with its camera and its view of the street. The side door, off the mudroom, the one that leads to the backyard and the pool house, where the only person likely to hear her would be Carol, who was at a hot yoga class clear across town, or Travis, who later told police he didn't realize how long she'd been out there because he had his headphones in. She had a thin school sweater on, no coat, no boots, no mitts. She was out there for almost 3 hours before my father went to check by his own account because he lost track of time watching the game. I was in a glass-walled boardroom on the 11th floor of an office tower on Bay Street when my phone lit up with Phoebe's name, 12 missed calls deep. I'd had it on silent for an internal meeting about the fraud case, the kind of meeting where you can't step out, where 4 partners are waiting on your numbers. When I finally saw the screen, my stomach dropped before I even answered. Phoebe was sobbing so hard I couldn't understand her for the first 30 seconds. Ivy was at Oakville Trafalgar Memorial, in the emergency department, with a core body temperature low enough that they were running warmed IV fluids into her and monitoring her for frostbite on her fingers. Her asthma had flared from the cold air and she'd gone into mild respiratory distress on top of the hypothermia. The triage nurse had asked my father, when he finally brought her in, how long she'd been outside, and he'd said, maybe 20 minutes. Which the doctor later told me was almost certainly a lie, based on the degree of hypothermia they were treating. I don't remember leaving the building. I remember being in my car on the Gardner doing 140, and I remember nothing about that drive beyond the white line markers blurring together and a sound coming out of me that didn't feel like crying, more like something tearing. When I got to the hospital, they had Ivy in a warming bed, wrapped in one of those foil-lined blankets, an IV in the back of her small hand, an oxygen mask fogging up with every breath. She was awake, which the doctor told me was a good sign, but her lips still had a bluish tinge and she was shaking, the kind of full-body shaking that doesn't stop just because you're warm now. The first thing she said to me, through chattering teeth, was, "Mommy, I didn't take the card." I told Grandpa I didn't take it. That sentence is the reason none of what happened next bothers me, not even a little. I sat with her for that first hour without saying a word to anyone else. I held her hand, I watched the monitor, I let the part of me that does cold, methodical work for a living go completely quiet, because in that moment I was only her mother. But somewhere underneath that, something else was already starting, the part of my brain that spent 6 years learning how people hide what they've done. I just didn't know yet how much there was to find. My father walked into the family waiting area an hour after I arrived. I watched him come around the corner with that same confident, real estate mogul walk he's had my whole life, the one that says the room belongs to him before he's even said a word. Then he saw me sitting against the window and something in his face changed. He'd assumed I was still in Toronto, hours away, that he'd have time to get his story straight, talk to Carol, talk to Travis, decide together what version of the night they were going to tell. Instead, there I was, already there, already having spoken to the doctor, already having read the chart. His hands actually started shaking. He stammered something about how he didn't realize, how it had gotten out of hand, how he never meant for her to be out there that long. I didn't raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice at my father in my entire life, and I didn't start that night either. I just asked him one question. I asked him how long he thought out there actually was. He didn't have an answer that matched what the nurse had already told me. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters for anyone's listening who's been in a moment like this. I did not in that hospital start planning some elaborate scheme. I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about my daughter's lungs, about whether the cold had done permanent damage to her fingers, about whether I was going to have to explain to her, someday, why her own grandfather thought a hockey card was worth more than her safety. The planning came later, after she was stable, after the doctors told us she was going to recover fully, after I'd had 48 hours of sitting beside her bed with nothing to do but think. And what I thought about mostly was Travis. Because here's the thing about being a forensic accountant. Once you start asking why someone is lying to you, you don't stop at the lie you caught them in. You start wondering what else they've been hiding. I had 8 years of low-grade unease about my father's finances, going back to that Christmas with the contractor invoices. I had never pursued it because it wasn't my business, because confronting my father about money had never once gone well for anyone in our family, and because I genuinely didn't want the answer. But sitting in that hospital room, listening to my daughter wheeze every few breaths, I stopped caring whether the answer was comfortable. I called in a favor with a colleague who specializes in real estate fraud and asked her, off the books, to walk me through what I'd need to formally request from the Halton Land Registry and from CRA if I suspected a family member of misrepresenting renovation costs to inflate a mortgage refinance. She didn't ask why. She just told me. And once Ivy was discharged, once she was home and safe and sleeping with a humidifier running and her inhaler on the nightstand, I started pulling threads. It took me 11 days. I want to skip past most of the financial detail because it's not the point of this story, but I'll tell you what I found, because the audience deserves to know what was actually at stake. Travis had been managing renovation projects on 3 of my father's rental properties for almost 4 years, submitting contractor invoices that were, in several cases, completely fabricated. He'd created a numbered company, registered in Carol's maiden name, that supposedly did the drywall and electrical work, and he'd been paying that shell company out of my father's renovation accounts, then pocketing the difference between what the work actually cost and what he billed for. My best estimate, conservative, was just under $210,000 over 4 years, money that had come directly out of accounts my father believed were funding legitimate upgrades to his properties. The hockey card accusation against my daughter wasn't some isolated cruelty. It was Travis protecting his own access to that garage, that house, that family trust, by making absolutely certain nobody questioned anything near him, including an 8-year-old who'd innocently looked through a box he should never have left lying around in the first place. I didn't go to my father with suspicions. I went with a binder. We have a tradition in my family, going back to my grandfather, of a big Sunday dinner on the first weekend of every month, the whole extended family at the Oakville house, Carol's cousins, my father's business partners, the works. 3 weeks after Ivy came home from the hospital, I went to that dinner for the first time since the storm. My father had texted me twice asking if Ivy and I were coming, in a tone that suggested he genuinely believed a fruit basket and an awkward hug were going to fix things. I told him we'd be there. I waited until dessert had been cleared, until Carol had refilled everyone's wine, until Travis had made his second comment of the evening about how kids these days don't understand the value of things, looking directly at me when he said it. Then I stood up, walked to the front hall where I'd left my bag, and came back with the binder. I didn't yell. I have never needed to yell to make a point. I set the binder down in front of my father, in the middle of the table, right next to the dessert plates, and I told him I had something he needed to see before Travis said one more word about value. Inside were the falsified invoices, side by side with statements from the actual contractors confirming what they'd really been paid, the incorporation documents for the shell company under Carol's maiden name, and a clean summary spreadsheet, the kind I billed for clients every single week, showing the full scope of what had been taken. I told the table calmly that this was the man who decided my 8-year-old daughter was a liar and a thief over a hockey card, while he'd been quietly stealing from her grandfather for 4 years. The silence at that table was the loudest sound I've ever heard. My father read 3 pages before he looked up. I watched something happen to his face that I'd never seen in 29 years of being his daughter, a kind of crumbling he usually didn't allow anyone to witness. He looked at Travis, then at Carol, then back at the binder, and I watched him do the math himself, the way I'd done it 11 days earlier, watched him realize that the man he'd trusted to manage his properties had been bleeding him for nearly $250,000, and that he'd locked his own grandchild outside in a storm to protect that man's lies. Travis tried to talk his way out of it, the way people like him always do, calling it a misunderstanding, an accounting error, claiming I'd twisted the numbers out of some grudge. I let him finish. Then I told him, calmly, that I'd already filed a formal complaint with the Ontario Fraud Unit, and that copies of everything in that binder were sitting with a lawyer who'd be in touch with him directly. That part wasn't a bluff. I'd done it the morning before, because I am, if nothing else, thorough, and because I wasn't going to threaten a man with consequences I hadn't already set in motion. My father didn't defend him. That was the part that surprised me most. I'd braced myself for him to protect Travis the way he'd always protected people who managed his money, the way he'd waved off my concerns when I was 22. Instead, he just sat there, very still, and asked me one question. He asked how long I'd known. I told him 11 days about the money. 29 years about how this family treats inconvenient truths. What happened over the following months was not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no shouting match, no scene where Travis was dragged out by security. It was slower than that, and in its own way more thorough. My father, once he'd absorbed what the binder showed him, cooperated fully with the fraud investigation, because protecting his own legal exposure mattered more to him than protecting Travis, which tells you something about both relationships. Travis was charged with fraud over $5,000 under the criminal code, and he eventually pleaded guilty rather than face trial, after his lawyer presumably looked at the same paper trail I had and told him there wasn't a version of this he could win. He was sentenced to 2 years less a day, served at a provincial facility, along with a restitution order that will likely take him the rest of his working life to pay off, assuming he ever gets work that pays again with a fraud conviction attached to his name. Carol, to her credit, was horrified when she learned the shell company had been registered under her maiden name without her real involvement, and she and my father separated not long after, though that part isn't really mine to tell. My father has called me every week since. Not to manage me, not to smooth things over with money the way he's tried with everyone else his whole life. He asks about Ivy's lungs, he asks if she's warm enough. He's started seeing a therapist, which is the single most surprising sentence I have ever said about my father, and he's told me, more than once, that he doesn't expect Ivy to forgive him, that he just wants the chance to earn it slowly, on her timeline, not his. Ivy still has the inhaler on her nightstand, and she still flinches a little when the wind picks up outside, but she's back to her regular self most days, swimming lessons on Saturdays, fighting me about bedtime, telling anyone who'll listen about the rookie card mystery she solved by accident. Last month, at her own request, she went back to the Oakville house for the first time since the hospital, just for an afternoon, with me sitting right there in the next room the entire time. My father gave her a small, carefully wrapped box. Inside was the actual 1979 Gretzky card, the real one, which it turned out Travis had been planning to quietly sell himself the whole time, never reported missing to insurance, never even truly lost. My father told her it belonged to her now, for as long as she wanted it, and that he was sorry it took losing almost everything to understand what actually mattered in that house. She put it in a drawer with her hockey cue tape and her favorite rocks and hasn't asked about it since, which is, I think, exactly the kind of forgetting an 8-year-old deserves to get to do.